Good point. All right, we are officially live right now.
Yeah. John,
Okay.
I could not. Yeah, I could not figure out that lower third.
Join the club.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
couldn't get mine to work. I got it loaded in, but it's not showing up in my
I have no
filters.
objection to those of you who have got it working to use that, and
Yeah.
I'll figure it out later.
Um,
So here's a question, just before we get
Yeah.
started. I know we're live and all, but do you guys if you were asked how many people have you baptized, do you have are you able to give a number?
No,
No.
I don't really. I don't know.
I can't.
No, I wish it was higher than I.
Yeah. It's not. It's
I
not
mean-
like I baptized so many I can't count. I just.
No. I didn't mean
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
If I go back
I
over
know,
my
no.
sermons, I could tell. I normally tend to make a note if somebody responded to that sermon or something.
The larger number of people I have baptized were not in response to a sermon, and more
Right.
in response
Yeah.
to a home study. But I'm just curious. When I read about, I received a magazine about preachers from days gone by, and it used to be a thing that
Oh,
you
yeah.
hear a lot. That they baptized, and when you mentioned Brother Keeble, I think they baptized this many people, and I just wondered if I was the only one who. As
No.
Brian says,
No.
it's not such a huge number that I couldn't possibly number them.
Yeah.
But it's just that I don't know that I've kept track.
I don't think it's a good thing.
No.
I think Paul is saying that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when he's kind of saying, "Hey, I don't even know who I baptized."
Yeah, in Corinth. Yeah,
And,
exactly.
and frankly, it's not like my baptizing them means I did the work of converting them. About half the people I baptized, somebody else did all the work. And a few people who've been baptized, I did all the work, and somebody else baptized them. So,
Yeah.
well,
I
I'll
don't
tell
know
you,
why it
I
was
started
better.
this when I first moved up here, and it's not exhaustive, but I've got a Bible, and in the back I started recording it. Okay,
Oh,
for one purpose, I have the person and the date, not for gloating reasons, but as a reminder to them from time to time. I had someone who wanted to be quote unquote rebaptized, and I was able to go back and say, "Well, you first obeyed the gospel on this date, so let's talk about that."
Yeah.
And but it's not for I don't have a number to it as far as where I could tell you, and I don't like that.
And that's why I record it, because I wanted to know at one point when I was, because I had forgotten. And thank goodness Guillermo had recorded when that happened, so I know the date. But that's the only reason why I keep it, is just in case somebody wants to know, quote, their birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Brendan, you mentioned that. I have these ancient gospel advocates. I'm talking about from the 40s and 50s, and they used to record that. So did Truth.
Yeah.
But before it was Guardian of Truth.
Yeah.
When it was Truth, they would have that report. So and so held gospel meetings. Held so many gospel meetings. There were so many baptisms this month at this church, and you had all. They were reporting those things, and I don't know if they were brag boards or what, but
Well,
or
and-
if they were fillers. Just to show you work is being done.
yeah.
I don't want to be the guy that pokes the holes in everything.
Yeah.
But I would really like to know what the retention was and how many stayed faithful. Because I told the elders when I came here, I said, look, once I got 4 or 5 people baptized, I won't be able to do any personal work, because I'm going to be doing new conference classes for the next year and a half.
Right.
Because there was a trend
By
in
the way-
evangelism in the 90s that my parents fell victim to. That was preachers would get real buddy with somebody, dunk them, throw them in the pew,
Yep.
and move on to
Yep.
the next person. And I've just seen that cause so many problems.
It's maybe
Right.
a lot like what we see with the Filipino reports, where we're seeing that there were 20, 30 baptisms this month, but why are there not? I asked the question at one point in time: why are there not churches that are in the hundreds and thousands? And I think there is such a situation with a lot of denominational error pulling people in a lot of directions that it's just it's not the same.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that, Paul, because I've observed that too, and I've wondered the same thing. Because as you said, I get a report of 10 people baptized every month, but the church is effectively the same size constantly.
Yeah,
and so I'm often wondering.
Yeah, Brendan, I have to say this. I disagree with one thing you said. Yeah. Doing convert studies, that is personal evangelism.
Yeah.
I know what you meant.
Right.
I know what you meant. But by the way, that's probably some of the more important personal work.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, because you found somebody that is interested, and keeping them is just as much as but you know that.
And it's I think Barry had written an article one time that really the whole process to convert somebody is probably a 2-year process. Because baptism isn't the end goal. That's just the start. And I think the goal is really to get them to where they have enough tools and they got their spiritual legs under them that they can kind of start feeding themselves and start thinking, start answering their own questions and stuff. So, sometimes, speaking of the baptism thing, we've had some members that were baptized someplace completely different and just shown up, and they're new converts, and our work is just making sure they mature. So,
okay. All right, gentlemen, it's about time to begin. So let me switch our view.
After all that discussion, I will do my very best to stay on track.
All right, Paul.
Not to just all of a sudden throw out some random question that's going to take us some crazy place.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that, Paul?
Everything.
All right.
By the way, good to see everybody.
Likewise.
Yes.
I'll try and keep an eye on the YouTube chat. I don't know if we want to divvy stuff up. So,
well, I'll tell you what, I'm able to monitor the Facebook and YouTube and Twitter feed, but I mean, it doesn't hurt to keep an eye on it also, that way, because sometimes the system is a little bit slow on getting something over. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, I've missed a few before in the past, so yeah, that'd be fine. And I don't have the email called up, but that's something we can always look at a little bit later, Paul. We can kind of set up a monitor for that too.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Okay, let's get ready to go.
Did you set up an order for things since I wasn't here early on? I was dealing with
it's essentially what's in the Google Docs.
Okay, so do we got 4 or 5?
I don't have anything there, so.
We have 5. So I'll start with the first one, then Paul will take the second one, kind of launch that one, and then I think it's Brendan.
Yeah.
Tom and Brian and Tom, I think, something like that. So, but we'll follow the order of it. Yeah.
Okay.
That sound good? All right, here we go. Let's do all the fade out and fade back in fun stuff. Well, welcome back. My name is John Duvall, and this is the Truth Factor discussion. It has been a little bit, hasn't it? I think we had our last study probably sometime around March of 2020 when we completed our Roman study. So you need to bear with us if you would. It's kind of like going out to your car that's been parked for a couple of years and getting in it and making sure everything functions properly. We might still have a few glitches. We've all live streamed since that year, but this particular setup, there's a few little oddities about it, so we might have a few glitches. I want to thank you for joining us for our study today. Now, there's a couple of things that I invite you to do, and we'll say this as we go through the study. If you're watching this via our Facebook channel, which is Truth Factor Live, we invite you to follow that page so you'll receive notifications when we do go live. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, which is also Truth Factor Live, you can like the video if you like it, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to do that. That way you'll receive notifications that way. We do have different ways that you can participate in the study. Let's see if I can bring that up here real quick. You'll see it on the ticker down at the bottom of the screen there. But over to the right-hand side, there's our social media. You can also send a comment via Twitter if you'd like to do that. You just need to tag Truth Factor in it, and the system will search for those tweets, and we'll bring it up here before us as well. And we'll bring this up. And if you want to contact the men individually, they're their email addresses, questions at, Brendan at, Brian at, you kind of get the idea, at truthfactor.com. All right, so let's see. So here's what we wanted to talk about in our first study back. And as you may have seen in the various posts we sent out, we're going to be looking at 5 lessons learned from the pandemic. But before we get there, because that's the year that we kind of paused our study, let's see where everybody has been, how things have been going. And there are some things we'll talk about that we have experienced individually from that as part of the lesson process. But let's start with Paul, since you're already up there on the Zoom channel. What have you been up to, if you would, since then?
Well, it's been an unusual experience with some of the modifications that we made, difficulties that we faced. I've had COVID myself twice. No major problems with that, but the congregation here lost, I think it was 3 members, if I remember correctly, that died due to complications from COVID. And so it's been, that was very, very difficult for us. And I'm glad that we're coming out of this, seeing improvements, and especially glad to be back here on the Truth Factor discussion at a new time, or same time, new day, that we can study together.
I appreciate that. And that's a very good point. Someone may wonder, why are we on a different day and not the good old Wednesday time slot? Well, someone took our time slot, sort of. There was another study going on at the same time, and as we kind of stepped away, they've got their footing very well, and that's perfectly fine. So we thought it'd be better to have it on a different day. So, all right, appreciate that. Let's see. Yeah. We'll figure out who to blame. So let's see. Let's go to the next one. How about you, Brian? How have things been in your life since that year?
Well, so in March 2022, I was working as the evangelist at the Sunset Church of Christ. I was also serving as one of the elders at the Sunset Church of Christ. A lot of changes happened to our congregation. As an indirect result of COVID, people started working from home, and a lot of our members work in the technology area. Portland's a very high cost of living area. So we saw about 40% of our members move back east to different locations where there was a cheaper cost of living, where there wasn't such a anti-religious feeling to a community. So we ended up dissolving the eldership, and we had to make some really tough decisions. And one of those decisions was having not able to support, well, we hadn't been able to support the evangelist. We weren't able to really even afford the location we were renting. We made the determination to merge and start a new work with another congregation. So I'm now the evangelist at the Cornelius Church of Christ. Cornelius is a small community that's about halfway between where the Sunset congregation was and the other congregation we merged with, the Forest Grove congregation, met. So that's a new work that we're really excited about. So good things in the end coming out of that, but a lot of change. Change doesn't always feel good. So I think a lot of people would say it didn't feel good at the time, but ultimately we're able to do God's work, and I think we're able to do it more effectively. So I think we're really, really pretty pleased with it.
Well, good. Now you're like Tom. You're over out there on the West Coast, and did you find kind of the lockdowns to be a little bit more tedious?
You know, it's interesting because just south of us, California, without waxing political, California had some pretty tight lockdown laws. Oregon typically follows California in a political sense. We're a one-party state, so to speak, and our politics tend to follow theirs. But frankly, this is where being an unreligious state helped us, because there just aren't enough people in the state of Oregon going to church that it really impacted or caused issues. So we really didn't see any kind of problems from the state. We were worried we might, but frankly, sadly, church participation of any kind is just such a low invested effort in our communities that we just never really saw any kind of problems. So while we anticipated that, and a lot of people would have expected it, we really didn't have any kind of issues at that time.
Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, let's bring in Brendan. You're out still in Arizona, aren't you?
Yep. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the furthest west the country goes. So, everything further west is away. No, I'm kidding. So I've actually been off the program a lot longer. It was Brian's fault I got brought in to begin with. And when I was my own panelist, I had just started my first full-time work, having completed my training in Oregon. And I bowed at that time as the workload was just a lot, getting adjusted and everything. That was a couple of years ago. So I hit my 5th year here at Country Club Road in September. So started the 6th year proper after that. COVID, we were very fortunate and very blessed with how it all worked out. We were able to keep the morning assembly the whole time.
Okay.
We changed a few things on how we did stuff, and we'll get into some of that when we talk about the lessons learned. But we kind of broke even. If we're talking numbers, we had some people move away due to employment, and then a couple months after they moved away, we got new families showing up, and so I feel like we're in a good spot post-COVID. I'll talk about that, but it definitely feels like a James 1, 3 through 4 experience for us. That we were tested, and we've come through the test. We've been refined, and we're stronger for it. So, so things are still warm and sunny down here, and I won't complain about that. So it's good to be back with our discussions again. So,
well, good. All right, and let's see, Paul, and let's go to Tom, and then we'll end up with Paul real quick.
Okay. Of course, I'm still here in Bellflower. I've actually been here about 27 years. And you may recall that just prior, well, I don't know if I said anything, but just prior to COVID, I was actually appointed as one of the elders of the congregation. We are a small congregation, a very small congregation in a lot of ways, but we're fortunate to have elders. We lost 2 members due to COVID, but we've learned to adapt a lot, and based on what Brendan just said, John, it looks like you have an international panel right now. But the bottom line is, we had to adapt to a lot of things. We are one of the congregations that kind of took the position that, to the best of our ability, we tried to comply with the local laws, and as a result of that, we were slow. We were slow in getting things back. We actually met in our parking lot for probably 6 or 7 months, and then we slowly went into one morning service at the building, and then finally we went to the evening. And all during this time, I learned to record my lessons, and so we now have a YouTube channel, Facebook channel, and I'm still recording lessons and so on. We actually didn't get back to in-person classes until this past Sunday. We have been doing it virtually, and of course we have a diverse membership from the standpoint of COVID. And when I get to my point, that's one of the observations that I'm making about that. We have people on both spectrums, as to all the elements associated with COVID and stuff like that. And we're still dealing with that. And I could say a whole lot more about different things that have changed, but we've come through it. We're doing okay.
Yeah.
I wish I could say more than that.
I think
there's challenges.
Yeah.
But that's it.
I think people out in California really suffered more Christians did as far as in the lockdown and the mandates and everything. But that's for another discussion.
And bear in mind, we are in Los Angeles County.
Yeah.
So we got hit double barrel. We got hit from state as well as county. When other counties were letting up, ours wasn't.
Yeah. All right, and Tom, or Paul? You want to bring us up to date? Oh, you went first. Did we do everybody? Okay, superb.
John, how'd things go with you? I don't think you said anything. So.
Yeah, we haven't heard from you.
Oh, it's pretty much the same. we're one of the congregations that we shut down for 5 weeks, and then we brought back Sunday morning worship, and everything was online, of course, before that, but then we did our Bible classes and stuff, and then brought Sunday night back in, and then finally got our in-person Bible classes back. But one of the things we'll talk about later has to do with the effects of not having in-person worship and how that can affect congregations and stuff. And we've been very blessed here. On a very personal note, my 8th grandchild was born back in December, so I'm like Brendan. I'm holding my youthful age very well. So you can't tell that. So anyway. All right, let's go ahead and let's see. All right, let's go ahead and get in. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Grandchildren? What are grandchildren? All right.
They just when you think you're done spending money on your own kids, they come along and say, "Here, we've got children we want you to spend money on also." So, yeah. Of course, you do it with a smile then because you love spending money on grandkids because you're trying to get into heaven. But when your own kids, kind of gripe a little bit about it. That's from an old skit years ago. All right. So, again, if you have any thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear from you. On our Facebook feed, on the live stream there's a comment area. You can drop your questions and comments there. On our YouTube channel, there's also a comment area there. Participate that way. You can send any questions or comments you have via Twitter if you would like. Just be sure to put @truthfactor, and that'll come up in our feed. So let's go ahead. The first one we're going to turn, I'm going to go ahead and introduce. One of the first lessons that, and there's a lot of things we could really talk about, so it's kind of difficult whittling it down. I didn't want to make this a study of where we gripe and complain about the whole process. There's a lot, of course, we could say about that. But I think one of the big lessons that struck me when we first started the pandemic was we need to remember to always trust the Lord. Okay, that was a big thing from the get-go. I mean, think about the virus and how big the scare was. Yes, a lot of people died from it, but I also blame the medical profession because in the very beginning they were trying to figure out how to treat it. They kind of seemingly threw out the old way of treating things and tried different things. But yes, it was a very, very scary thing. But in the end, it was upon Christians to continue trusting the Lord. When you sit down and you study the scriptures, you think of fellows like Joseph. Joseph was sold into Egypt. The Lord didn't say, "Hey, Joseph, the son of Jacob, I got some good news for you. You're going to have a wonderful life without any problems." No, he went down and suffered in Egypt. Now, he was working a plan of God. I realize that. But that man suffered while down in Egypt. When you look at what Jeremiah went through as a prophet of God, when you look at what Daniel went through when he was in the land of Babylon, when you look at even coming into the New Testament time period, we don't find the Lord promising his followers that life is going to be a rose garden, that there are not going to be any problems or any sufferings. When you think about the apostles themselves, Jesus right off the bat, Jesus was martyred. He was put to death for our salvation. That's a very violent beginning if you look at it from a very physical standpoint, the way that he died. And so for us to think that if God is with us, then our life is going to be just peaceful and paradise here on this earth, that's a misunderstanding. And so what happens oftentimes when things begin to get difficult, the question is kind of, well, where's God in this? Why is God letting me go through all this? And so people want to start blaming God. But here's the thing. You think about the death of Stephen, the death of James, the punishment, persecution that the Apostle Paul went through, and by tradition, Peter and all the apostles except for John died, were martyrs for the cause of Christ. You think of everything they went through, and even Peter's own words about if Jesus suffered, then we must suffer also. We have to ask ourselves, then what is God doing in all this? If he's letting me suffer, he let me get COVID. He let my loved one die because of COVID. What is God taking care of? Well, here's where we have to recognize that the most important thing to God, in my opinion, as I study the scriptures, the most important thing to God is not our physical well-being. It is our spiritual well-being. Jesus didn't die for our physical well-being. He died for our spiritual well-being. Romans chapter 8 is a very beautiful passage, and it culminates there when it says that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Nothing can separate us from God. So when you bring all that into our perspective, when we go through difficulties, we need to trust God. I think that's the benefit of prayer. Prayer isn't so much where we say, God, make me better. God, why didn't you make me better? God, please don't let me lose my job. And I lost my job anyway. It's all about us trusting him enough to say, here's my worries, and I'm going to cast my cares upon you. It's like a kid coming to a parent. Now, does that mean that I'll not go through difficulties? Absolutely not. But I'm not going to be worried about them as I would be without a wonderful Heavenly Father. And so, I mean, do we worry about things? Absolutely. Do we stress about things? Definitely. But ultimately, we need to trust in God. So when the next pandemic comes along, we need to make sure to keep that in mind. And you got the scare tactics, and some of it was genuine. I recognize that. A lot of it was genuine. But we always have to remember God will take care of us. So what if I die? God will still take care of you. What if I lose my home? What if I lose all of the physical things? God will still take care of you. And it's hard to see until we look beyond this life and realize what God is really protecting and holding and caring for is our soul and our eternal home with him in heaven. So I really think going back, looking at the COVID, that's one of the things that we learned. The need to trust God. Take precautions, but don't become so fearful that we quit serving him. So that's kind of the thought that I had on that. Not very specific verse-wise. There's a lot of things we referenced in there. But let me go ahead and see if anyone has any thoughts or comments about that. I'll throw the gallery view up there. Anyone have any thoughts about that before we move on to the next one?
I'll jump right in.
Go ahead.
So maybe it's just because we're starting to study Hebrews here, and the Hebrew Christians were facing a dangerous situation. I think it's more than just going back to the old law. It's more of renouncing Christ and all that he offers and all he is. Mm-hmm. And the Hebrew writer's solution to that crisis point was, we need to deepen your faith. We need to help you grow in your faith, because a mature faith endures trials and persecutions and calamities. And I think there's a lesson for preachers, at least for me, that is, I think of what Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, verse 5, that the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and unhypocritical faith. That maybe not that we shouldn't rebuke error in the pulpit, but maybe we focus a little bit more on teaching that deepens faith, seeks to build our audience up to maturity, so that when events like this happens, we're not having to do triage as much and kind of be reactionary to preaching lessons that fit the moment of, it needs to be timely, but do the preventative preaching that seeks to mature a person so that when we get to these situations, we're not having to go back and relay a foundation like the Hebrew writer did in chapter 6. It became... Yeah. So it became very clear, elders and I talked about, we preached through Philippians like a month in to COVID, because it became apparent that okay, we need some faith building stuff. We need to focus on the joy that God gives in the midst of these types of trials that we're going through. So that was my thought on that, to kind of complement that. So,
well, and I think Hebrews 12, the Lord chastens those whom he loves. The challenges we go through are those steps whereby we are chastened by the Lord. We are made stronger. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on that? All right. So let's see. Sorry about that for you watching the live stream. I was delayed in throwing the gallery view up to you. But let's see. The next one in our list of lessons learned. Paul, if you would, tackle this one and introduce it, if you would.
Well, as we were beginning our study this morning, the thought was that maybe it would be beneficial for us to talk about the importance of being in person for worship. We all probably realize there are times, depending on where we live, that maybe weather is prohibitive, or maybe for a period of time. I know that we had a situation where we had a an outbreak of COVID locally here, where we all of a sudden had a service, and right after that, we had a large percentage of the congregation get sick. And so, one of the things that we observed here is the importance of being together, actually physically together. Uh, we did stop meeting in person for a while, and looking back, I could play the hindsight game, but I'll try not to do that. But in thinking about that, seeing the importance of being together, the congregation here really missed that. We missed being together. We missed sharing together in that. And the first time we just came back and we did the parking lot situation, everyone was just so excited to see one another. And then our first service back in person in the building, sitting in the pews together, was just, it was dramatic seeing how much we had missed one another. I think about when Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, and he says, when you come together as a church there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I had that pulled up a moment ago, that when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. And in part, I believe it. That there was something very special about when they came together and they were all together in one place, in engaging in these activities. In fact, he says, therefore, when you come together in one place. And so as we think about that, I just think that we observed that we really missed that. And there was a study that was done. I don't know if it's one of those Pew Research or which it was, but it said that they anticipated that most congregations would decrease in size. Now, this is including denominations and everyone else, would decrease in size by probably 40 or 50%. We didn't see that. We have seen some decreases, some struggles, some folks who got very comfortable in their pajamas, watching services online. But for the most part, we all just really missed that. And we see the value of the Lord's plan and being together in one place, not seeing each other on a screen, together in one place. And I just think that that's a lesson that I've learned through this, is how important it is to see one another, even for physical contact. People were afraid to shake hands. People were afraid to hug. And I just said, well, you can hug me and you can shake my hand and, whatever. But I wouldn't make someone else uncomfortable by forcing that upon them. But just that personal aspect of being together is just really an important part of the local congregation in worship, in Bible study, in other environments, just having the opportunity to be together. And I'm just so thankful that we have come out of this. And recently, a bunch of us got together on an individual basis for like a New Year's Eve thing. And we look forward to more things like that where we can be together in person. I realize that's an individual activity, not a church-sponsored activity, but you understand what I mean.
Well, there is a sense where the local congregation is a family, and so while the church itself may not fund those things, we as individuals still want to be with one another. Yeah. Tom, you had a comment?
Yeah. I actually am wrapping up a 2-year, one Sunday a month study of 1 Peter. And he's dealing with persecutions. And one of the points that's come out over and over in that particular study is how much we need each other. And that builds on Paul's point. I don't know about you, but over the course of the last 3 to 4 years, and I know what's been happening, our society has become so much worse morally. It is so corrupt. And of course, remember, in California, we're at the forefront. We're at the brunt of the laws. But what we get, wait about 10 years and you'll get it. But the bottom line is one of the points that I brought out continually in 1 Peter. And I think one of the points Peter is making is, as you're dealing with sufferings and strugglings, you need to have a proper attitude toward each other as brethren, because we need each other. And the more difficult the times are, the more we need each other, which is why we ought to and must appreciate the importance of the church. Yeah. And by the way, one real quick thought on that. I make this point about the church all the time. Ephesians 3:10 and 11 talks about how the church was a part of God's eternal purpose, and it is also a manifestation of the wisdom of God. When manifold wisdom of God is made known by the church. And the point of that text is you can look at the church and you can see the manifold wisdom of God. Now, I always like to ask the question, what church is he talking about there? Is he talking about the church in its universal sense, or is he talking about the church in its local sense? And of course, the answer to that is both. Yeah. The local church is just as much a part of God's pattern as the overall concept of the church. And we need to keep that in mind and respect its boundaries and realize if that's true, God knew what he was saying when he told us to be a part of it. So anyways, enough said.
Good point. Any other thoughts on that?
Tom, I appreciate what Tom said on the topic. And as I think about that, it's just, I know that folks say, well, we could be together electronically. We could be together in some kind of study. And I would
not
argue
the same.
And say, yes, it is not the same. It is not okay for that to be a long-term plan. I don't believe it's okay if I were to decide to move out somewhere where there was no local congregation and say, well, that's okay, I'll just engage online. I don't think that's what God's plan is. I don't think that's right. I just don't. And I realize that for temporary situations, we've tried, and I think one of our.
Did we lose Paul? Or Paul's froze?
We might have.
I like to say something bad about me, and I think he got cut.
Well, while we're waiting for Paul, I'll just throw my comment on Paul's discussion here is amen to everything he said. And I'm just going to continue his point, not the point I was going to make, but I'm going to continue because I think I know where he's going. I think what we need to keep in mind, and I'll bring this up when I cover mine, is all this online stuff is great, but we need to have this understanding that it is a supplement, not a replacement.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very telling when at the end of 2020, going into 21, Alistair Begg, the denominational preacher out of Ohio, large church, they released a 5-minute video from his office where he says, we have been getting mail that people have been telling us they're using our live stream as their church. So because of that, we are no longer going to be live streaming on Sundays. The sermons will be uploaded on Monday, but we are encouraging you, mask up and be part of your local church. Support your local preacher and elders. Be part of the local body. And I thought, you know what? I have respect for that because they are intentionally saying we're turning away the views, we're turning away all all the attention because we believe strongly in the local church. And I thought, that should have been the attitude.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, Brendan, that was our decision as an eldership to not stream live.
Yeah.
I mean, to this day, I still don't really know how to do a whole lot. I would love to, especially gospel meetings, but I was not interested. I was not interested in streaming a morning service live because of the potential for abuse.
Well, see, we've been streaming since 2008.
You did it before the pandemic.
Yeah, so. And the one thing that and before I ever served as an elder, as a preacher, I would reiterate this, and the elders would reiterate it to the members. The stream is not for you to stay home and not come to services. It's for when you're sick. Sometimes people are away traveling and they are prevented from being somewhere with the saints. It's strictly a means of edification, not a substitute for worship. And I kind of cringe sometimes if I hear someone say, we hope you can join us for worship even online, because my thoughts are that's not, Now, during the pandemic, we did for the time period, we would have songs playing with the words and stuff and music, but the recording that we played was of our own congregation, and it was intended for because they had some members ask for it so they could sing along at home with it. But it was, again, still an aid. It was something to edify, not something to be a substitute for assembling. And, one of the big things a lot of congregations have dealt with is some people, when they quit worshiping, assembling with the saints in person, it was hard for them to get back into the habit of going again. And that's, y'all have already touched on that. So, yeah. Well, let's go ahead. Or go ahead, Tom. Then we'll move
John,
on.
just real quick, and I know this. We're talking about Brendan's point here, but I mean, in many of my videos, my YouTube videos, recording, I will say that at the beginning. If you're in the area, come worship with us. I said this is not intended as a substitute, and I'll emphasize that at the beginning of multitudes of sermons on a monthly basis.
Okay. All right, let's see. Let's go ahead and move on. Who was the next one? I think it's Brendan.
Brendan with technology.
or Brian.
No.
It's Brendan. Okay. From my perspective, Brian pointed down like Hollywood Squares, and he's pointing at Tom.
Yeah,
so.
He should have been pointing this direction because I'm in the upper right-hand corner from what I can see. So.
All right, well, let me put you on full screen, and you go right ahead there.
Okay, so I think the big lesson for me coming out of this was kind of just the extension of Acts 5 and verse 42, where it speaks of the early saints, and every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Christ. We had a big crop of new converts right when COVID hit, and priority number one for me was we need to make sure they still get edification and they're being taught, otherwise we're going to lose them. So the first thing we did, I got onto Zoom like everybody else, and we started doing a Sunday afternoon new converts class, and that lasted about 6 months or so going through that. And Zoom opened up or allowed us to continue to do the work we already were doing. I was doing an in-person meetup study, and we already had people in that, so we transitioned that to online. And that actually allowed for me to continue to do some studies with some individuals. Our new conference class turned into just a normal Bible class Sunday afternoons, and we went through Acts. And anyone was really open, anyone was welcome to it, but we handpicked and invited the members who were probably the most in need of edification or that other avenue. But the big thing for us was we wanted to make sure the opportunities for edification and encouragement were still there. So we already were live streaming before COVID hit, and we were using OBS, and that kind of worked sometimes. So we updated our system and everything, and we live streamed everything directly through YouTube. And so as a result, oftentimes we have visitors now that show up in person who have already watched the service or already heard the preaching. And so they seem to be much more comfortable than interacting with visitors. And, they kind of already know what to expect. In fact, one of our deacons, his first Sunday here, I went up to shake his hand and says, "My name's Brendan," and goes, "Oh, we know. We've been watching." And so it's been beneficial in that. As kind of our new normal is, as we have moved into cold and flu season, what we saw was the in-person numbers dip a little bit, but the online connections tick up. And then that inverts again in the fall, in the spring when we're out of cold and flu season. It's also opened up another area of service that we hadn't thought of. And that is, it takes 2 to 3 guys running the tech station to make sure the live stream and the audio and the auditorium and everything runs smoothly. And so that's opened up an area for maybe some of the men who aren't the most comfortable in a public setting, public speaking. This is more behind the scenes stuff, but it gets them involved. And the live stream has been a godsend for our shut-ins, because before we did that, shut-ins basically had no connection. And, I think it's a common issue in most congregations that sometimes shut-ins get forgotten about. This way, they have some means of connection, and they know it's not the same as going in person. Every time I do visitation, that's what I hear from them. It's like, I want to be there. But for one reason or another, they just can't because of health. And so we were live streaming everything. We're just down to the services now and Bible class. Well, yeah, just the services, I think it is. And we've changed how we do some things on that. And then YouTube, we greatly expanded what we upload to YouTube now. And Sunday evenings during the pandemic, we did a pre-recorded study. It was on the Psalms, and then we did Matthew. And we've had some pleasant surprises because of that. I got an email a year ago from one of the Methodist churches in town. Their youth group was using our Matthew videos for their youth devotional. And I went, great. You guys are in for a wild surprise when you get to Matthew 28. But the Beatitudes video has been circulated and watched 1.5 thousand times now. I don't know why that video is the one that's been circulating, but it has been. And throughout all this, the evidence that we've seen the fruit for us, and this worked for us. We maintained the avenues of edification and encouragement. Our elders did a great job of making sure everyone was getting checked in on, and we kept a pulse on everybody, and we were calling in. They were calling everyone. And so when we went back to all in-person services, we always had the Sunday morning worship. People were ready. People were definitely ready. They were appreciative of the Zoom classes and the pre-record stuff, but they said, it's not the same as me being there in person. So when we came back to all services, actually, we didn't have an evening worship to begin with. It was just an evening Bible class. And so at one point, we had 3 Bible classes going at one time. And the members really benefited from that. But as a whole, this worked for us. And I think it kind of just opened our eyes that technology can be a positive good for a congregation. It has been for us. But each congregation is kind of got to make the determination for themselves. We had the infrastructure to do all this. One of our elders worked at the former, his last assignment in the Air Force was the GI cable network. And so he had all that audio visual experience. We had some really smart guys to help out with that. Other groups, it fell mainly to the preacher. And that may not have been tenable for a lot of groups, or the know-how's not there. And, in hindsight, we could play the shoulda, coulda, woulda game. I'm choosing not to. But coming out of COVID, I think this is, for us, it was a James 1, 3-4 event for us. We were tested, we were tried, and we came through a closer congregation, a stronger congregation. And, we found our happy medium where we're at, and prioritizing the in-person assembly, but also keeping the live stream as that needed avenue for when you're sick or you just can't attend. So that's all I got.
Well, I think those were great points. It really, you're right. I mean, I used to joke back then that the pandemic turned nearly every preacher into a TV evangelist. Just about. So, all right. And I think we all had similar experiences. So, like Tom's already talked some about what they went through. And Brian, you were able to do some of the pre-record. Y'all did an FM broadcast, didn't you?
Yeah, only about 2 weeks. It was a terrible experiment. So we were too close to a major road. Not a lot of FM stations available around here. So we did that 2 weeks, and then we said, let's just move inside, and whatever the consequences are, we'll accept them.
Yeah. I wish I could say that everything we did was proven to be effective in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
But the data is just not there. It's kind of like someone said, run a flagpole and see who salutes it. It's kind of like that was going on, and never mind. So any other thoughts before we move on to I guess Tom, you'll be the next one. Any other thoughts on this one?
No, Brian was next in the list. But.
Brian was. Sorry, I don't have my list up. I keep flubbing up. But Brandon, go ahead real quick, and we'll throw it to Brian.
Real quick, I just wanted to bring in the one comment we have on Facebook, and we appreciate Jared Dart watching, and we're glad to have him back. So
let me see if I can bring that one up.
We're glad to be
here
back, so he can. So
there we go. There's Jared State. Boy, it's a nice picture of him, too. Jared has grown a good bit since last time we were in our study. Yeah, he got a truck, and he's got a solid job, and he's doing good. He even came out here for a couple weeks, and Jared's doing really good. All right, so let's see. All right, Brian, let's throw this back to you now.
Well, some good things have been said today, and I don't want to go on with what I had to say. First of all, I thought that the fear conversation was fantastic. And I think that was the big thing a lot of us dealt with. John, that might have been the biggest thing that we needed to think about was what are we afraid of? Persecution, getting sick, all these things that people were suddenly terrified about. And that was a big lesson to me to think about. What Paul said about getting together, that was huge. And by the way, that's an ongoing, just how big a deal it is kind of lesson that we get away with. And what Brendan talked about when he was talking about technology, that changed a lot of things for us. I mean, the way that we interacted or chose not to interact is all great. I don't have too much of substance to bring into those kinds of statements. So let me just kind of maybe take a little bit of a different path here. When I wrote down what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about the idea that one of the things we learned, so you don't make decisions that you're not prepared to have to see long term. And not a big lesson here, but let's just say I know that every one of us, whenever back in March 2020, when we start talking about lockdown and stuff, and remember what everybody's saying, 2 weeks, we flattened the curve, right? And we believed it, which is kind of funny that we all the time say, hey, don't trust the world, don't believe everything you hear. And we believed it. And what do we do? Well, one of the things we sat down and one thing that I would share is that we sat down and asked questions like, well, do we have an authority to close to close an assembly? Not to not come to an assembly, but to close it down. That's a tough question. That's actually a more serious question. A lot of times, we can consider, does a congregation have an authority to terminate an assembly? We talked about things like, what is the intended purpose of the assembly? We had some really great studies about these things. And one of the things where I think we were successful that I would share is that we said any decision we make could potentially be something that we're not talking about 2 weeks, but maybe a whole month of it, which of course it turned into a year. And we realized, when it comes to decisions that have matters of authority involved, it really isn't about the time frame. What you need to make decisions about is to think about the idea of a decision that could be for the rest of the existence of your congregation. So things like, and I want to be careful how I word this, and I've got a second point to follow up with this, but we would look at it and we'd say, can a congregation worship online? Well, we would say not, somebody might say, well, on one Sunday, but if we see the authority to do it one Sunday, we're saying we can do it from now on. And so we knew that that's a bad idea. So a lot of our thinking, we came to decisions based on, what if we have to do this for more than 2 weeks? What if this is a month? What if this is 2 months? And so we tried to coach our thought processes and our decision making in terms of, what if this is just how it's going to be from now on? And we don't know. And so we tried not to make any decisions that we would regret, or that if they went on more than, a month or two, we would say, hey, we can't keep doing it this way. And that was a really beneficial thought process that we took on. We prioritized. We said, we've got 3 big things we're concerned about. Number 1, the worship and the assembly of the church. Number 2, Romans 13 and obeying the law of the land. And number 3, the safety of the members. And those aren't equal propositions, we decided. We decided we had to prioritize them. And, of course, the scriptures tell us, give to God the things that are God first. So he would get worship, even if that meant in some way violating the law of the land, even if that meant putting members in danger, which was a tough decision, to have to make. And sometimes that is an important decision that churches have to come up with. But let me make my second point, and maybe that's a more valuable point in some ways. One of the things that we also learned about midway through is that every congregation that anybody had any connection to, that I knew of across town, or that, somebody else had a brother that attended, or somebody else their kids went to, every congregation did things differently. Every single one of them. And there were decisions that were made that we kind of say, oh, that doesn't sound very good, or, oh, that's definitely not a good way to go. They did what? And that's probably all of us were in a position where you heard something and said, oh, I don't think that was the right decision to make. But one of the things that we had to accept was the idea of, and you're thinking I'm going to say autonomy, but that's not it. Expedience was the conversation that we had. That the real issue is no two congregations are the same. Now, I'm going to avoid stepping on what Tom has to say, because I know Tom wants to talk about everybody's different. And that's actually a little bit of this point here. But one of the things that had to be reminded of our members a lot is somebody'd say, hey, did you hear what this church did? And I'd say, well, wait a second. Demographically, there are a lot of older members there, or there are a lot of members that have to travel there, or there are they're a smaller group, or they're in a region where there's things different. And one of the things we had to accept is that, not being in their position, we just don't know what is expedient. I think a lot of times brethren aren't familiar with the term expedience, or they don't really appreciate how expedience works into the work of the church. And yet, Brendan's discussion on when to live stream, or the comments that were made about whether or not a church should live stream, those are questions of expedience. Does it benefit? It's not wrong to have, a video of things that you're doing in the church, but is it more beneficial or harmful? Does it create or foster a sense of learning, or does it potentially foster a sense of, I don't want to go to the assembly? And the answer is, it depends. And that's expedience. What is expedient for one group might not be expedient for another. So one of the things that we began harping soon as we start hearing chattering, saying, hey, you know what this church is doing? You know what these people are doing? And of course, some of that was, hey, we're not doing that. Maybe we should. Is that no two congregations are the same. And that we make, once we understand the authority of a decision, expedience is a big part of that. What is expedient for us to make decisions about things like, do we stream? Do we, how do we assemble together? What does our assembly look like? And it really was never appropriate for us to sit down and say, hey, that other group didn't follow our pattern, therefore they're really not quite, I'll use the word sound. You can say a lot of different things. They're just not doing things right, whatever you want to say. And we had no place to make statements like that. And looking back, we still don't have a decision to make. And yeah, some congregations have suffered for what I believe are bad decisions. But in the end, there's a big difference between an authorized or unauthorized choice and an expedient or inexpedient choice. And I'm just going to have to let the Lord sort this one out. I'm sure 2,000 years ago, they struggled, whether it was the famines, the persecutions, with changes like this. And one of the important points is we just really needed to focus on ourselves and do what was expedient for us.
Very, very fine points. We've got a couple of comments within the guys here. One thing, though, that came to mind, Brian, as you were talking about that, think about all the sermons that have been preached in your lifetime by other preachers and yourself, and my lifetime the same, that would say if the government ever told us we couldn't worship God, we would have to disobey our government. Well, we kind of found ourselves wading, in a manner of speaking, into that without realizing we were already in it in some places. But I think it's a very valid point. Every congregation is autonomous, and I'm not going to restate what you said because you already did it. Brendan, go ahead. I think it's a good point.
I'm just going to amen Brian's comment. Some of the things that gave me heartburn during COVID was just the lack of understanding expediencies and just respecting congregational autonomy. I know you didn't use that word, but I'm going to use it. And we kind of forgot the other restoration saying, our favorite one is speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible is silent. The other one was in essentials unity, and non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity. And there was some pretty nasty debates and fights that happened online that really weren't showing the love of Christ and the unity that believers are supposed to have. And just like there was congregations where I had friends that preached, I'm like, I'm not sure I could deal with that, but I'm not your elders, I'm not you, I'm not that congregation. Yeah. And what I wish we had more of, and this is the shoulda, coulda, woulda part, was just giving brethren the benefit of the doubt. We had lost all the institutional memory, I'm going to use that term, from the last pandemic. I don't know of a single person alive who was in leadership in 1918 who was in leadership in 2020. So there was no reference point for us to go off of, like, how do you handle this? Yeah. It was gone. And so it was all new territory. So anyway.
Well, we add to that without even talking about congregations, opinions of one another, if you would. And a lot of the chat forums, even within women forums, my wife was kind of talking to me about it. There's a lot of outright arguing going on about, whether masked, not masked, vaccinated and unvaccinated. And we had brethren, people who called themselves Christians, taking some very angry positions and takes, if you would, on this stuff. And it didn't foster love and unity among brethren.
Well, that goes back up to the first point, right?
Yeah.
Faith or fear.
Yeah.
And, I think we look back and we all could have grown more in faith and love and charity. So
exactly. One thing, Brian, there was an issue even before the pandemic that illustrates the very thing that you're talking about. So over the last, it's been going on for 10 years now, but it seems to be more frequently over the last 5 years. A lot of congregations are dropping their Sunday evening services. Okay. Now, I've always maintained that that's up to them. It's an expediency. It's a matter of judgment. Whether or not we meet twice on Sunday, 3 times on Sunday. If we want to be really holy to God, we'd meet at 2 a.m. in the morning. Well, it'd have to be 11 to keep sure. Well, 2 a.m. Sunday morning, we could do all that stuff. But I have seen brethren highly critical and view other congregations being weak because they choose to go to one service on Sunday. I don't like the idea myself, but I'm not going to look at another congregation and say, shame on you, you're not spiritual, you don't love God as much as we love God. And those attitudes were even around before we hit the practices of the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Paul addresses that when he says it's not wise to compare yourself against each other, and that's, I think, what a lot of people do when they do that. And you said it right, John. This is not a pandemic issue. This is a issue that has been around a long time. We're probably more aware of it because of technology, in the sense that we have chats and comments that we can see all the time. I don't hear, 10 years ago, I didn't hear what brethren said in Florida nearly as much as I do now. So that's a little bit of it. But I think it has always been a matter, and this is what it is for me personally. This is my sin. Let me just confess my sin on an internet audience, everybody can hear, is that sometimes I want to feel better about myself by putting down others, instead of trying to find acceptance by doing what's right. Genesis 4, I'm saying, oh, I'm a little better than that guy, and I tell you what, I slip that direction all the time, where I start thinking, well, at least we didn't do what that church did, as some kind of strange justification for who I am. And here's our God and Savior shaking his head when Brian thinks that way of, you're a little better than the other church, Brian. Really, that's your justification. And of course, ironically, I can't even do that over what I said a moment ago, the matter of expedience. So, John, what you're saying is really important. That a lot of times it's tempting, and we do it personally too, right? We say, hey, I may not always be perfect, but I'm better than this brother.
Yeah.
And that here's Paul, and that's probably what Paul meant originally in his statement, because the Corinthians certainly had a lot of that kind of thing going on. Hey, we're disciples of Paul, we're better than the disciples of Peter, and that was his frustration there. So it's really tempting to try to measure my congregation's success off of other congregations, and how unwise and unprofitable and vain that kind of thinking is.
Brian, you're the only Christian I know of that's ever had that problem. So, we can't relate to it.
I understand.
Next is we'll talk about lying. So, all right, let's move to the last one here real quick before we run out of time. And Tom, I think that is yours.
Okay, we're out of time. No. Yeah, you know what? We spent a few minutes introducing ourselves, so I guess if we go over maybe.
Yeah, we were a few minutes late starting, so go ahead. You're good.
Yeah, okay. Anyways, the last point that I made is one of the things I've observed about the pandemic, and it relates to a lot of what's been said, is how people are different. And that includes congregational demographics from that standpoint. You know, in virtually every congregation, even within the congregation, you know, we're talking about other congregations. What about inside of a congregation where you find it didn't matter how big you were, there was different points of view about, you know, mask, no mask, vaccine, no vaccine, assemble, don't assemble, online, not online. Let's see what I forget. I mean, you know, you just keep going down the list. And fear, no fear, you know, all those types of things. And who's right? You know, that brings to a debate. And one of the things that has been brought to my mind, and there's nothing new about this. We know that people are different, but I think in this, you know, this is a good time to remind ourselves about how people are different. They're brought up differently. They come from different environments. They, you know, their background, their culture, the things that are influencing them, that's going to affect the way that they think. And when you say that, you know, I'm not just talking about overall, I'm not just talking about appearance, I'm talking about deep down. It affects their thought process, which affects the way that they make decisions. And you know, from a spiritual standpoint, you can give the illustration of, you know, you try to convince somebody that the Bible does not teach faith alone, as in all you have to do to believe. You know, but if they were raised with that doctrine, you know, you're not just gonna show them Acts 2:38 and convert them. You know, you have to work to overcome that. So the bottom line is that people are different, and we need to realize that. And because of that, we have to remind ourselves, and we've talked about this a lot today, is that we're brethren. We have to remind ourselves that we are brethren. You know, the Galatians 5 passage, do not use your liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. And then in the next verse, he says, but if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed. And I want to tell you right now, in this world that is looking to criticize Christians, they're sitting back and loving it. They're actually loving it the way that we are just devouring each other. And it is so prevalent, you know, that people see it. And so we're giving the Lord a black eye when we behave like that. So the bottom line is we need to acknowledge that not everybody thinks like me. And you know what? I think that Romans 14 in the brotherhood is a passage that has been abused by a lot of people. You know, that's the passage that talks about liberties, you know, and there are people that use that to justify doctrinal error, you know, and even though we differ on doctrinal errors and so on, we still need to fellowship each other. And you know that's not what Paul was talking about. But I'll tell you this, should you wear a mask or not wear a mask? Should you get vaccinated or not get vaccinated? Friends, that's Romans 14. And you better respect your brother if your brother differs on that. So, you know, we just need to remind ourselves that we are different. Now, what are some things that we can do about it? And I'm going to this last paragraph here in my thoughts. Here's some points to help dealing with that. You know, number one, we need to learn to be patient with each other. We have to do, and I think that's one of the points Paul was kind of making in Romans 14. Number two, we need to be very slow when we pass judgment on somebody else. John 7:24, Jesus said, judge with righteous judgment. Number three, you need to realize that as you deal with the differences of others, you know what? They're dealing with your differences too. We sometimes don't think of it from that standpoint. We look at them and how wrong they are, but you just realize that they may be thinking the same way about you. And that's why we need to have this proper attitude where that is concerned. And then the thing that's been emphasized by all of us in one way or another, love is the answer. Godly Christian love has to prevail. And if we do those things, we can overcome whatever the next thing is, whether it's another pandemic. We live in California, that they've been discussing shutting us down again. Masks again. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but what are we going to do this time? And we have some members in the congregation that have concerns, and so we've got to address all that. But anyways, that's kind of my point when I think about all of this. So can't we all just get along? An abused statement, but there's truth to it.
Yeah. All right, Tom, I appreciate that. Any other thoughts or comments about that?
It was great. Yeah.
Spot on. Now, tell you what, let me share one. I'm going to think we could, if we were going to assign a Bible passage to 2020, I would suggest we assign the following to it. Here we go. Colossians 3:12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another, if anyone has a complaint against another. For as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. Of course, the Apostle Paul continues in the text by telling us to put on love and other in the context there. So something for us all to remember. All right, let me throw it back to everybody one more time, and we will pull our study to a close this morning. Any other, there we go, final thoughts? I'll do a brief review real quick of all the points, but go ahead, guys.
I was just going to say the COVID experience probably changed the church for our generation more than any other experience. And I think that's it's important that as we come out of that we do learn lessons and we do make applications of those things.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And I would say to that, John, Lord willing, we are coming out of this.
I believe we are.
But on the other thing, just let me say it this way: I don't want to go through this again. If I don't have to, I don't want to go through it again. Of course, it could be worse. We could be facing something worse in the future.
Well, if it was a pandemic of sci-fi story proportions, half the population would be gone now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you ever watch any sci-fi movies, that's the way it always worked. I mean, the first day, quarter of the population's gone. This was, a lot of people lost their life, and it was very tragic. But it wasn't that.
Percentage-wise, it wasn't what it was portrayed to be.
Yeah, there are other things taking lives just as much, Paul, Brendan, any other thoughts? Okay. Nada. All right, so here we go. Real quick, the 5 points takeaway, the 5 lessons that we learned from COVID are as follows, or the pandemic. Always trust the Lord. The importance of in-person worship. We talked about it being possible to edify brethren using technology as an aid. And made a very good point. Don't do things you wouldn't want to do forever. And he had a bonus point to that I didn't put in there. And people are different and will have their own differing viewpoints. So I think that's very, very telling. And so I tell you what we're going to do next week. I've got slated for us to look at 5 tips for improving your Bible study. Now, this is not going to be a forever trend regarding how we do our lessons, but for the month of January, we're going to each share 5 tips, 5 lessons, 5 warnings. We have different subjects we'll consider. And then in February, we'll pick up our study of Ecclesiastes. We'll start there in February. And then we'll try to throw some topical studies in between our book studies. We might even try doing the last Thursday a month as being a Q&A session. Just depends on how much that we have coming in and everything. But I'd really like to thank you for joining us for our study today. If you'd like to contact us, there you'll see it on the screen. You can follow us on our social media. You can also email us individually, just our first name at truthfactor.com. You can also send questions to us at that address as well. All right, let me quit hogging the spotlight. I'll bring everybody back. And gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me as we started the Truth Factor back. And Lord willing, if everything goes according to plan, we will continue the study next week. And as I said, we'll be looking at 5 tips for improving your personal Bible study. Appreciate it, everyone. Y'all have a great day, and we'll see you next week.